So we basically sat down in a room with our pastor, and who's also a psychologist, which is helpful. And he's known my mom for a long time, and she can talk to him about all this stuff. So he was a great mediator. And I basically said, Mom, we're all here because our relationship's are at a breaking point and none of us want it to go on this way. And she nodded and agreed. And I said, well, I wanted to bring up and talk about the fact that you had once gotten the diagnosis of borderline. And, that was in 2005 or 2006 or so. And, nothing really ever came of that. And, you started out in a group and it didn't work out. And I think that maybe we should relook at that diagnosis for you. And she sort of looked up at our pastor and said, I didn't think that was a diagnosis anymore. And he said, what? And I said, what? And she said, I thought that they didn't diagnose anyone with borderline anymore. And we said, no, our pastor said, no, it's a real diagnosis and it's still around. And she said, oh. And he said, well, what do you think of that? And she said, I think my mother had borderline. And my sister and I thought, what? That's the first we heard of it, that our grandmother had borderline. My grandmother died when I was 2.5, so we didn't know her. But apparently when my grandmother died, my mother really felt like there was unfinished feelings and emotions and business. And so she apparently researched it and came to the conclusion that maybe her mother had borderline. And the little I've heard of my great-grandmother, it sounds like she also had some of these traits. So it could have very well been passed down the line. She said that she would come home after school and her mother would be screaming at her. And she was a little girl and didn't know what she did wrong. And her mother would be yelling and would go up to her bedroom and get into bed and close the door. And my mother would be left there. What she thought of the intervention was that we were doing this out of love. And she was touched, and it made her feel good that we cared enough to do that. And she said, we have time to fix this. She said, I'm not dead yet. I didn't even prepare myself for the fact that she might be touched and it might be positive for her. I just was preparing myself for the worst, for her to be angry and defensive and get upset.